The call came in, and before the customer could even finish their sentence, the agent snapped, "Listen, I don't have all day. Either tell me the problem or hang up." The CEO, now disguised as a new hire, sat frozen at his desk. This was the third call he'd overheard in the last hour where an employee had been outright rude. He had expected some issues when he decided to go undercover, but this was worse than he imagined. 3 days ago, he'd made the decision to see things for himself. His company owned a chain of call centers spread across multiple cities, but he'd never personally met most of the workers. Lately, complaints had been piling up, customers reporting rude service, unresolved issues, and even accusations of employees hanging up on them. His management team assured him everything was under control, but he wasn't so sure. So he became Mark Davis, a 38-year-old man looking for a fresh start. He dyed his hair darker, wore glasses, and dressed in simple, worn-out clothes. His background story was simple: laid off from his previous job, looking to make ends meet. No one questioned him. In a place with dozens of new hires every month, he was just another face in the crowd. Now, sitting at his cramped desk, headset on, he listened closely. The agent next to him, a man named Kyle, scoffed as he ended another call. "God, these customers are so stupid," he muttered, leaning back in his chair. "It's like they don't know how to read instructions." Mark clenched his jaw. The customer service philosophy he had built this company on, respect, patience, and empathy, was nowhere to be found. His trainer, Lisa, walked up and placed a stack of papers on his desk. "All right, Mark, time for you to take your first solo call. Just follow the script, and if the customer gets annoying, just mute them and pretend you're looking into it. That's what most of us do." Mark frowned. "Mute them?" Lisa shrugged. "Yeah, most of the time they just want to complain. No point wasting energy on them." He hesitated, then put on his headset as a call came in. "Hello, this is Mark. How can I help you today?" A shaky voice came through. "Hi, I was charged twice for the same order, and I just need a refund. I tried emailing, but no one got back to me." Mark pulled up the account. It was a simple fix. "I see the issue here. I can process the refund right now." Before he could finish, Kyle leaned over and pressed the mute button on Mark's headset. "Dude, don't waste time on these. Just tell them to email support again. It keeps our call times low." Mark unmuted. "Ma'am, I'll get this sorted for you right now." The relief in her voice was immediate. "Oh, thank you so much. I've been trying for weeks." He processed the refund in seconds. It was that easy. Yet, according to the reports he had reviewed before going undercover, hundreds of customers had been denied refunds for similar issues. As soon as the call ended, Kyle rolled his eyes. "Man, you're not gonna last if you waste time like that." Mark turned to him. "You don't think she deserved help?" Kyle scoffed. "Look, we're not paid enough to care. Management doesn't give a damn, so why should we?" Lisa nodded in agreement. "Honestly, the only reason I haven't quit is because no one micromanages us. As long as we hit quotas, we can do whatever we want." Mark felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had trusted his upper management to enforce company values, but clearly they had failed. Worse than that, they had created a culture where employees believed that cutting corners was the norm. But then, amidst the chaos, he noticed something different. A few desks away, a young woman named Mia was handling a call with genuine kindness. "I understand how frustrating that must be," she said softly. "Let me personally follow up on this and make sure you get your refund." She finished the call and sighed, rubbing her temples. Another agent beside her, a man named David, smirked. "You know no one cares, right? You're working too hard for this place." Mia shot him a glare. "Just because no one else cares doesn't mean I won't." Mark made a mental note. By the end of the day, he had seen enough. The majority of the employees were either dismissive or outright rude. They put customers on hold for no reason ignored complaints, and even laughed at people struggling to explain their issues. But then there were the few Mia, a handful of others who still tried to do the right thing despite the toxic environment. As his shift ended, he sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel. He had built this company to help people, to make things easier for customers. Instead, it had turned into a place where employees abused their power and no one held them accountable. This had to change. And it would start tomorrow. The next morning, Mark walked into the call center with a new sense of purpose. He had seen enough on his first day to know that things were broken. But now, he needed to understand just how deep the problem ran. As he took his seat, he noticed Mia already at her desk. She had her headset on, speaking gently to a customer, while others around her mindlessly clicked through screens, barely paying attention to their calls. Kyle was already in his usual spot, slouched back in his chair, spinning a pen between his fingers. "You survived your first day," he said, smirking. "Guess you're not as soft as I thought." Mark forced a chuckle. "Yeah, just trying to get the hang of things." Lisa strolled by, tossing a packet onto his desk. "Here, read through this when you get a chance. It's got all the shortcuts." "Shortcuts?" Lisa shrugged. "Ways to get through calls faster. How to redirect complaints so they don't count against your stats. That kind of thing." Mark flipped through the pages. It was a guide, not for helping customers, but for avoiding responsibility. Phrases like, "Tell them you'll escalate, but don't actually create a ticket." "If they ask for a supervisor, pretend to transfer them, put them on hold, then come back as the manager yourself." "If a refund is requested, tell them it's under review, even if you don't plan to process it." Mark felt his stomach twist. This wasn't just laziness. This was a system, a culture that had been built, encouraged, and left unchecked. He set the packet down, keeping his expression neutral. He needed more. He needed to see the management side of this. So, during his lunch break, he wandered toward the supervisor offices. The door to the manager's lounge was slightly open. Inside, he spotted Brian, the call center's floor manager, leaning back in his chair, feet propped up on the desk. Beside him, another supervisor, Jenna, scrolled through her phone. "You hear about the complaint reports?" Jenna muttered, not looking up. Brian snorted. "Another one? What's it about this time?" "Same thing as always. Customers say we're too slow, agents are rude, refunds aren't being processed." Brian groaned. "God, people are so entitled. Look, as long as we hit our call quotas, corporate isn't gonna care. They only look at numbers, and guess what? Our numbers are fine." Jenna shrugged. "Still, if it gets too bad, we might have to pretend we're fixing it." Brian laughed. "Fine, we'll fire one of the low performers next month. That usually shuts people up." Mark clenched his fists. They weren't just ignoring the problems. They were actively covering them up, letting good employees like Mia struggle while people like Kyle and Lisa skated by, unchecked. He turned away before they could notice him. As he walked back to his desk, his mind raced. This wasn't just a bad team. This was a failing leadership structure, a complete disconnect from the company's core values. And then, a voice caught his attention. "Mia." She was standing, her face red, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Across from her, Kyle sat smirking. "You think you're better than the rest of us," Kyle sneered, "just because you actually try." Mia's voice shook, but she held firm. "I don't think I'm better. I just think customers deserve respect." Kyle rolled his eyes. "Yeah, well, respect doesn't pay the bills. You think the bosses care about you? You're wasting your time." Mia exhaled sharply, grabbing her bag. "I'm done. I can't do this anymore." Mark's heart sank. She was leaving. One of the few people who actually cared was walking away. He couldn't let this happen. Before he even realized what he was doing, he stepped forward. Mia, wait. She turned, surprised. Kyle snorted. Oh great, now the new guy's gonna lecture us too. Mark ignored him. He looked at Mia, really looked at her. The exhaustion in her eyes, the frustration. You're right, he said quietly. This place is broken. Her brow furrowed. He hesitated, then made a decision. It was time. He straightened. And then he pulled off his glasses. Kyle frowned. What the hell are you doing? Mark ran a hand through his hair, pushing back the dyed strands. Lisa blinked. Wait, you look familiar. Silence fell over the room. Then recognition dawned in Mia's eyes. Her mouth parted slightly. No way. Mark exhaled. My name isn't Mark Davis, he said, his voice firm. My name is Richard Lawson, and I own this company. A gasp rippled through the room. Kyle's face drained of color. Lisa stumbled back a step. Mia just stared speechless. Brian and Jenna, hearing the commotion, stepped out of the lounge. Their eyes went wide. Mr. Lawson, Brian stammered. Mark turned to him, his expression unreadable. I've spent the last 2 days working your floor, listening, watching, and what I've seen is unacceptable. Brian opened his mouth to protest, but Mark held up a hand. Just don't. He took a slow breath. Starting now, everything changes. No one dared to speak. Because they all knew. The reckoning had begun. Silence. No one moved. No one breathed. Kyle's smirk had vanished. Lisa's face had gone pale. Brian and Jenna stood frozen in place, their mouths slightly open, as if their brains were still trying to catch up with what had just happened. Mia, she was the only one who didn't look afraid, just shocked, maybe even a little relieved. Mark, no, Richard let the moment linger. Let them feel it. Let them understand exactly what was happening. Then he spoke. I built this company from nothing. His voice was calm, even, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that cut through the air like a blade. I built it on trust, on service, on the belief that if we treat our customers with respect, they'll trust us, that if we treat our employees with respect, they'll take pride in their work. Slowly, he turned his gaze to Brian. But that's not what I found here. Brian swallowed hard. Sir, I heard everything, Richard interrupted, his voice like steel. Every excuse, every lie, every single way you've been covering up problems instead of fixing them. Brian's mouth snapped shut. Richard let his eyes scan the room. I heard agents muting customers just so they wouldn't have to deal with them. I heard refunds being denied for no reason other than keeping call times low. I read a guide, an actual guide, teaching employees how to deceive customers into thinking they're getting help when they're not. He shook his head, disgusted. That wasn't just laziness. That was a system, a culture. He turned back to Brian. And it came from the top. Brian took a step back. Sir, please, Richard cut him off with a look. You don't get to talk. Brian's face twisted. He opened his mouth again, but then he closed it, he knew. And Richard wasn't done. He turned to Jenna. You knew about this, you let it happen. Jenna's hands trembled slightly, but she forced a weak smile. Sir, we were just following standard. Standard? Richard snapped. You knew the complaints were piling up. You knew refunds weren't being processed. And your solution was to fire a low-performing agent once a month to make it look like you were fixing things. Jenna's face fell. Richard took a step forward. No one moved. Let me make one thing very clear, he said, his voice low but firm. Starting today, everything changes. Brian swallowed. What does that mean? Richard didn't even hesitate. You're fired. The words hit like a hammer. Brian's entire body stiffened. Wait, what? You heard me, Richard said. You're fired, effective immediately. Brian's face turned red. You can't just. Yes, Richard's voice was ice. I can. Brian looked around, as if searching for support, but no one spoke. No one moved. Even Jenna had gone rigid, her eyes darting between Richard and the door. And you, Richard said, turning to her. You're gone too. Jenna's breath caught. Sir, please, You had a choice, Richard said. You could have spoken up, you could have done something, but instead, you let it happen, you let it fester. He shook his head. You don't belong here. Jenna's lips trembled, but she saw it in his eyes. There was no arguing. Slowly, she stepped back. Brian's face twisted with rage. This is ridiculous, you're overreacting. Richard just stared at him. Get out. For a moment, Brian looked like he might argue again, might fight back, but then, he saw it. Richard wasn't bluffing. With a sharp breath, he turned on his heel and stormed toward the door. Jenna followed, her steps slower, her face blank. And then, they were gone. The room remained silent. Richard turned back to the floor. Kyle, Lisa, the others. They all stood frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. Richard's gaze landed on Kyle. Kyle, who had spent the last 2 days mocking customers, teaching new hires how to get away with doing the bare minimum, treating this job like a joke. Richard tilted his head. What do you have to say for yourself? Kyle swallowed hard. I was just doing what everyone else was doing. Richard nodded slowly. Exactly. Kyle blinked. Wait, what? Richard sighed. You followed the example that was set for you. He glanced around the room. Most of you did, and that's the problem, isn't it? No one dared to answer. Richard exhaled. I could fire all of you, right now, I have every reason to. A ripple of fear spread through the group. But I won't. Confusion flickered across their faces. Not yet, Richard said, because maybe, just maybe, this wasn't entirely your fault. He looked back at Kyle. You've got one chance, he said. One chance to prove to me that you can actually do this job the way it was meant to be done. No more shortcuts, no more games. Kyle hesitated, then slowly he nodded. I understand. Richard turned to Lisa. That goes for you too. Lisa's face was pale, but she nodded quickly. Richard let his eyes scan the room one more time. If I catch anyone pulling the same stunts I saw these past 2 days, you're gone, no second chances. Silence. Then, slowly, heads nodded. And then, Richard turned to Mia. She was still watching him, wide-eyed. You were about to leave, he said. She hesitated. Yes. Richard nodded. Why? Mia let out a breath. Because I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't watch customers get treated like garbage. I couldn't work under people who didn't care. Richard studied her. Then, he smiled. That's exactly why I need you to stay. Mia blinked. What? I need people like you, Richard said. People who actually care. People who want to make things better. She swallowed, but what if nothing changes? Richard's gaze hardened. It will, I promise you that. A long pause. Then, slowly, Mia nodded. Richard exhaled. Then, he turned back to the rest of the room. Starting today, he said, this company is going back to what it was meant to be. A place where customers are respected, where employees take pride in their work. The room was still tense, still filled with uncertainty, but Richard could see it, a shift, a spark. It was just the beginning. But it was a start. The next morning, Richard arrived earlier than usual. Before the calls started rolling in, before the employees took their seats, before the weight of the previous day could sink back into their routine. He stood in the center of the call floor, staring at the rows of desks and computers, thinking, reflecting. This place had become something unrecognizable, but not for long. The doors opened. Employees trickled in, their eyes darting toward him. Hesitant, uncertain, some whispered. Some avoided looking at him entirely, but everyone knew things were different now. Mia was the first to approach. She clutched her bag tightly, her expression unreadable. "You really meant it?" she asked, her voice quiet. Richard nodded, every word. She studied him, searching for any sign of doubt, any hesitation, but she found none. Slowly, she let out a breath and set her bag down at her desk. She was staying. One by one, the others followed. Kyle sat at his usual desk, but this time, he didn't slouch. He sat up, alert, aware. Lisa took her seat, glancing at Richard briefly before logging in her usual smirk absent. The room didn't hum with the usual lazy chatter. No one leaned back in their chairs, discussing ways to avoid work. No one laughed about customers behind their backs. Because they were watching, waiting. Waiting to see if Richard would follow through. He did. The first order of business, restructuring. Within an hour, a team from corporate arrived, setting up in the conference room. HR representatives, senior executives, people Richard trusted to enforce the changes that should have been in place all along. Brian and Jenna were officially removed from the system, their final paychecks processed. Their desks were cleared out, their names erased from company emails. Richard didn't waste time replacing them with another set of unchecked managers. Instead, he promoted from within people like Mia, who had proven their integrity. Mia hesitated when he offered her the supervisor position. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she admitted. Richard smiled. "You've been doing the job without the title. Now, you'll have the power to actually make a difference." She nodded, slow but determined. With new leadership in place, Richard moved on to the next issue. The toxic culture. He gathered the entire team, stood before them, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the room. "I know some of you are waiting for things to go back to the way they were," he said, "waiting for me to lose interest, to walk away and let things slide again." A few glances darted around, a shift in posture. "I won't," Richard continued. "From now on, this company operates on one principle: respect for our customers, for each other, for the work we do." A silence. Then a voice. "Kyle. What if we don't know how to change?" His voice was quieter than usual, less cocky, more honest. Richard tilted his head. "Then you ask, you learn, you try." Kyle swallowed, then nodded. Training sessions were scheduled, not just for technical skills, but for customer service, empathy, accountability. Employees were given real feedback, real coaching, not just warnings and punishments. And the shortcuts, the deception, it ended. The call scripts were rewritten. The refund policies were adjusted to be fair, not just profitable. The customers who had been ignored for weeks, they were called back, personally, by the new leadership team. Some were shocked, some were skeptical, but most were grateful. Because they could feel it too. Things were changing. Days passed, then weeks. The atmosphere shifted. The tension that had once filled the room began to ease. Employees who had been disengaged started paying attention. Calls that once ended in frustration now ended with solutions. And Richard, he didn't disappear. He didn't retreat back to his office in another city. He worked shifts alongside them, took calls, listened, learned. Because he had promised. And for the first time in a long time, he felt connected to the company he had built. One afternoon, as he was wrapping up his shift, Mia approached him. "You stayed longer than I expected," she said, crossing her arms. Richard smirked. "You thought I'd give up." She shrugged. Most CEOs would. He nodded, glancing around the room. "Most CEOs don't get the chance to see what I saw." Mia studied him for a moment, then she smiled. "Well, I think you might actually pull this off." Richard chuckled. "I think we already have." And for the first time in a long time, he knew his company was exactly what it was meant to be.